Good morning, everyone. Hello. It's an honor to be here with you today. I'm excited about this conversation we're about to have. We're just going to explore, broadly and specifically, how climate and environmental changes affect our mental health and what we can do to prepare ourselves to deal with these impacts. So, to get us started broadly, I'll just ask, we hear a lot about how climate and environmental changes impact the planet physically, whether that be a slow creeping event such as a drought or a sudden disruption such as a hurricane. But how is it that these transformations affect us as humans socially?
Thank you, Britt, and good morning, everybody. Is that working?
I believe it is.
That's good. So I think that's a really great question, and we do hear a lot about the way that climate change is affecting our planet, our natural environment particularly. What we hear less about is how it affects the built environment, and I was fascinated to hear the conversation we were just listening to earlier about urbanisation and health. And we hear even less about how climate change may affect our social environment. And one of the key pathways through which it does affect our social environment is through its impact on our built form. And major weather-related disasters, you can think of dozens of those that do, cyclones and floods and fires and so on, destroy built environments. And when that happens, people lose their homes, they lose their livelihoods, they lose their means of getting around their cities and places where they live. And that disconnects people, and anything that disconnects people or interrupts their capacity to engage with one another, especially face-to-face, is a very significant risk factor for their mental health and well-being. Going on beyond that, the slow creeping disasters that we hear maybe a little less about, particularly thinking about drought and soil erosion related to climate change and loss of productivity from our oceans and so on, those tend not to have immediate, acute, very obvious impacts. They tend to creep up more slowly. And they have a very insidious effect on our social isolation by undermining the viability of local economies. So if fish are not available in a particular part of the ocean, fishing villages are affected. If farmers are not able to farm their land due to long-term droughts, they can't use the local services and support the local businesses that they would normally seek support from. And those communities start to die, and they don't die in an even way. What happens is people start to leave them, and those who leave them first are those who are most equipped to do so, those with the greatest levels of wealth, of education, of networks and opportunity. And so those communities become gradually impoverished, and they lose those who can most easily and readily contribute to them. Once you get this kind of community decline happening, then you have quite possibly one of the greatest risk factors to mental health and well-being that you can have, and the withdrawal of one of the greatest supports. So I think the social environment and the way that climate change may affect that is a very important area for us to understand.
And what are some specific examples of evidence we have for how climate and environmental changes affect our mental health?
I think the evidence base for the most part at the moment is in the area of disasters and their impact on mental health. And this is an area that's been studied for quite some time now, and ideas are reasonably mature around it. We know that acute disasters such as cyclones and fires and floods and so on have immediate impacts on population mental health, and rates of psychiatric morbidity in these areas will be often 3 times more than they would be without the disaster. And we also know that for the most part, the psychiatric impacts, even when they're quite severe, resolve naturally within a year or 2 at the most. But that for a minority of people, which is a non-trivial minority, these psychiatric impacts morph into long-term psychiatric disorders that create psychosocial disability for very many years afterwards unless treated. We also know that in these acute disaster situations, treatments, if provided quickly where needed and well targeted, are very effective. And it's an area where disaster management is focusing its effort more now. So not just mopping up floods and putting out fires, but actually thinking about the mental health impacts at the time, because the sooner you address them, the more likely you are to be effective in doing so. The slow creeping disasters like droughts and soil erosion and so on tend to be associated more with mood disorders. So essentially they get you down, and over time they really get you down. So looking at the kind of depression, suicide pathways there. And with the fast onset acute kind of disasters like fires and floods, they tend to be related more to anxiety disorders and development of traumatic symptomatology. So I think a fair bit's known about that, and therefore some of the ways that those issues can be addressed preventatively.
And there's some interesting evidence around heat waves and increased trends towards violence and self-harm as well.
That's right, and heat waves are known, in my world anyway, as the hidden killers, because we don't see them. So when we see fires and storms and floods, we see the disaster on TV, we hear about the number of people who lost their homes and possibly even their lives. We don't hear about heat waves in the same way. But each year heat waves kill far more people than all other weather disasters put together by miles. And we don't really have great responses around these. And we know that they increase violent behaviour. Interpersonal violence rates go up markedly during heat waves, particularly around day 2, 3. And group violence about 3 times as much. So people are much more likely to be violent in a group setting when the weather's very hot and has been for a while. But there are also, and suicide rates increase as well. And as we know, men complete suicide around 2 to 3 times as often as women do, and they use more violent means to do it typically. And again, these rates of suicide increase during heat. Interestingly, there's some evidence around very cold weather having an impact on increasing suicide rates as well, but the story when it comes to climate change is overwhelmingly about heat.
And Vikram, perhaps you could tell us a bit about vulnerable populations when it comes to mental health impacts.
Sure. Thank you, Britt. First of all, I want to just say what an important moment this is, that a conversation on mental health is actually happening in an opening plenary session in a Congress on planetary health. I don't think this happens very frequently, and also to acknowledge that the very appointment of a professor of climate change and mental health is something which certainly took me by surprise, but it also reflects how finally the world is beginning to turn its attention to perhaps the single most important aspect of our well-being, which is our mental health. And maybe I'll just do a little thought experiment here. When you heard the word mental health in this particular symposium title, just the first thing that came to your mind, how many of you thought about sickness? Can we have just the 1 or 2? Yeah. And how many of you thought of wellness? A lot of you are still wondering what it is you thought about, but it does look like wellness rules. And I think that is a really important point here, isn't it? Because we're not only concerned when we talk about mental health, about mental disorders, although that is an extremely important area, but we're also very, very concerned about our own capabilities to be productive members of our communities, to be able to deal with the everyday stuff that we have to deal with. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, how does climate change, how does environmental degradation affect the everyday stuff that is thrown at us? And I think certainly the slow creeping events that you described, Helen, are very important. In my own work in central India, where drought has been chipping away at the well-being of farmers for the last 15 years, suicide of farmers has become a very important political issue. In fact, it's an issue in which elections are actually being fought and lost. And I think if I had to look at the mechanism through which this works in my conversations with farmers, it isn't an acute event. It's the gradual erosion of your sense of hope for the future, the everyday uncertainty that is in your mind every morning. Will it rain today? Will it not rain today? Will there be an infestation of pests? Will I actually have enough crop to sell by the end of the summer for me to pay the debts that I have accrued? This is a really central element of how our mental health gets affected. And you're quite right. I think a lot of the conversations around mental health have been around acute disasters. But in fact, I think the far more pernicious consequences are these slow-burning environmental changes. I also wanted to say something about the last session where we heard the word tsunami of migration. And this connects very importantly with your question about how does it affect our social environment. I think I can see at least two ways in India, which is the main area the country where I've spent most of my life working in. The first is that by the fact that rural environments and livelihoods are becoming increasingly compromised, the social networks that people have thrived on are being devastated because of the more fitter people leaving, but also when they land up in the urban slums that we heard about in the previous session, there is a real challenge of building the same kinds of networks because, of course, in an urban slum, you often find yourself as an anonymous member of a very plural community with whom often you have very little historical or cultural connection. That is an extremely important piece. And the second piece is, of course, that if we agree, and I certainly believe this is the case, that inequality is a profound influence on our well-being, on the social capital that forms the essence of our sense of self, then there's no doubt in my mind that what we're seeing happening as a consequence of climate change and environmental degradation is a increase in inequality, because the people who are more likely to be able to cope with and perhaps escape from that particular situation are obviously going to be those who are better resourced, leaving behind often the people who don't have enough resource. So the vulnerable people, to turn to your question, I think for me, one very important vulnerable group that has often been left behind are people who already live with serious mental illnesses. Far too often when communities are coping with the consequences of climate change, for example, people with serious mental illness are the ones who are completely forgotten. And I would say this is one of the most vulnerable groups that we should be considering. And of course, more generally in a country like India, women who have to actually bear, even in good times, most of the burden of care and labor. But in fact, this often gets even worse in situations.
That was an excellent overview of populations affected. But what can we do when we want to pivot towards solutions? How can communities now, whether they're in low or mid or high resource settings, actually prepare to withstand some of these psychological burdens that come with these environmental changes?
I think I'd love to hear some more from Vikram about this and his work in India, which is so important. But I think when we think about how we go about addressing the challenges of climate change, whether they're affecting our mental health or affecting any other aspect of our lives and well-being, we need to be very strategic about how we think about this. And I think in the age of me first and everything's about me and everything, I think we have a tendency to think it's down to the individual, and I think that's a really dangerous place to go, mainly because as individuals there's not an awful lot that we can do. Individuals all acting together, sure, but as individuals, we can change our light bulbs and eat less red meat and so on, but we need so much more than that. So I think focusing on the individual level is not the main place to be. It's a place to be, but not the main place. Similarly, at the other end of the scale, focusing all our attention on governments and what they should do and large international organisations is not a great place to be either, because they're slow to move and some of them are completely unresponsive still, and there are limits to what they can do. They have a very, very important role, especially around setting law and policy. But there's a limit to what they can do. I think the real action has to be somewhere in the middle, and for me it's at the large group, the community level that we can see some real opportunities for change and for effective action. And I think it's really about learning and relearning the skills of acting collectively at the local level. And by local, I don't just mean neighbourhoods, although they're extremely important, and geographic spaces, but local across our networks and even some of our online networks, and coming together to clarify for ourselves in our multiple local communities what exactly the climate change challenges are for us as a group, and then coming together and discussing and deciding as a group what we're going to do about that, and then doing it. And that has the benefit of being a big enough a big enough group to have some real effect and small enough to be manageable and not unwieldy. And the wonderful thing about coming together in groups to solve problems that affect the group as a whole and to act in the general good, as opposed to acting in my personal good, is that if you do that well, you automatically build social capital, the connectedness between us, the knowing each other, the reciprocity, the trust, the sense of belonging, the care. And these are the things that we need for good mental health and to help prevent mental illness from developing and to support the fastest and best possible recovery should mental health problems arise as a result of what climate change is doing to our physical and social environments.
So I think Helen's very nicely answered your question in terms of the role of communities for prevention and promotion, building resilience and social capital. So I'll just turn to the other aspect, which is the role of communities in caring for people who are affected by mental health problems. And in my mind, this is perhaps one of the most exciting areas of global health, which is really redefining the role of who is a carer, a provider of care for people with health problems. And I want to really emphasize a very important development in the last 2 or 3 decades, which has characterized the evolution of the field of mental health care, which is the incredible dominance of a very narrow biomedical perspective. So that when we think about mental health problems, the first idea that springs to most of our minds will be a hospital, a mental health specialist, a clinical intervention. Working in places like Zimbabwe and India, where I've worked for most of my life, one of the great advantages of working in these countries, of course, is that there are very few such mental health professionals. So one has to, there's no disruption in the innovation because there's actually nothing to disrupt. Well, one has to essentially start from the ground up. And in fact, there's very little pushback as well. And after 15, 20 years of incredible innovation that's been happening in the space, it's safe for me to say that the real solution to mental health care in most parts of the world, and I would also suggest in this country, is actually bringing mental health care back into the communities that are most affected. And by that I mean by utilizing community-based providers, such as community health workers, peers, and a range of other kinds of non-specialist providers to be equipped with the skills to deliver psychological and social interventions that I believe are amongst the most transformative and effective of all mental health interventions, but have been systematically devalued because they don't really fit very well within the biomedical model. But in fact, we now have a very large body of evidence. For those of you who are interested in evidence-based practice, more than 100 randomized controlled trials. This is not a small body of evidence. It's an extremely substantial body of evidence demonstrating the feasibility, the acceptability, and most importantly, the effectiveness of this approach. Finally, I'll just say that it's also important for us to go not just to the community, but also recognize, as the previous panel pointed out, the intersectoral nature of responses that we need for mental health care. And we must also keep in mind another very important and emerging conversation, which is a rights-based perspective on mental health care. And by this I mean not just the right to be protected from the harms that we know affect our mental health and well-being, as we see on the southern border of this country, but also the right for dignity, the fact that dignity is a central human right, and this is often the first thing that is removed when someone comes face-to-face with the mental health care system, particularly in the context of serious mental illness.
So a lot of what you've discussed so far pertains to what we understand about exacerbated mental health impacts on people after an event or an environmental transformation. And right now, many people in this room will be familiar with discussion of other forms of emotional hardship and distress that come not from necessarily being in an impact zone, but from understanding what is happening to the planet, whether that be a phenomenon such as eco-anxiety or climate despair, or people feeling a profound sense of loss or grief of the natural world, and now an increasing number of people of childbearing age saying they don't necessarily feel comfortable having children because of their fear of planetary change. These are distressing trends, and I'm wondering how you think we should be configuring them within the context of mental health and planetary change.
I think that's a very important area, and one I know is rising up in public consciousness at the moment. I completely understand this and how young people are feeling, and and why they would be asking some of the questions they're asking, really big questions. I think it's important to get behind the issue of climate change a little bit in understanding this. We live in a world that is the way it is because a small minority of people and groups have exploited the planet and its resources, including its human resources, to an extreme degree and without regard for the effect that that has on the planet that we live on and rely on for all of the ecosystems that we need to survive and the people that live on it. At the moment, we're in a situation in our world where our world has so much wealth and so much technology that there doesn't need to be a single hungry person, a single homeless person, a single person suffering needlessly. The situation that we have in the world where millions and millions of people are in these situations is not because we don't have the resources to solve these problems, but because for one reason or another we choose not to. And climate change has arisen, and global warming and the destruction of the resources of the physical and natural resources of the planet. These things have arisen because of our greed and our unwillingness to share, our comfort with allowing the inequality gap to rise year on year to extreme degrees, and our refusal to use our knowledge and our technology in the service of humanity. In countries states that have right-leaning governments, rates of suicide are higher than they are in states and countries that have left-leaning governments. I think that's because they say, these right-leaning ways of thinking, they say, I'm fine, if you're not fine, that's your problem, go solve it. Those are very distressing messages. The messages coming from the world's leaders and from the world's most wealthy countries and most wealthy individuals is, we're fine. If you're not, that's your problem, go solve it. And I don't think we can take that message forward and expect that there will not be an impact on the health and well-being, and particularly the mental health and well-being of the world's population and the huge numbers of people who are not in that circumstance where they can afford not to care. And young people in particular are in the situation where they often don't have the full access to resources they may have as their lives develop, and they have far more than their fair share of challenges, and not the support to deal with this. So I think as a world, we had opportunities which were grasped particularly after the Second World War, to come together as a world and think about the big questions affecting the well-being of everybody and of nations. And we've lost our ways somewhere and lost our humanity in the process. And really, I think that when we think about promoting good mental health and dealing with those struggling with mental illness, humanity needs to be the first place that we go and the guiding principle for what we do. And maybe that's a little bit of a roundabout answer, but that's where I think we need to be.
Thank you. We have just...
Can I just say something about eco-anxiety? Sure. Because now I know what that word is. It's a new one. But actually, I want to connect you with the conversation I had with my son last week. He's 21 years old. He's a student of wildlife biology and conservation, in fact. And he was speaking to me saying that he was extremely upset because he'd been in a conversation with other students in the class. His main interest is tiger conservation. And he was saying, what's the point of me sitting and working on tiger conservation when the enormous structural forces that are leading to encroachment into natural protected areas in India are almost impossible to combat through this kind of local action. And I was forced, and he was saying how upset he was, and I was forced to think of a quick answer on how I could, as a dad, respond to this. And so my answer to him was that it's impossible for any one person or any one action to deal with incredible complex issues such as climate change, on environmental degradation, human population pressure, etc. But you have to find your particular place in the whole sequence of actions that is needed and make sure you're connected with others as well, so that you're aware of them, you're supporting them, but you don't necessarily have to be responsible for every single action that you take.
Thank you for sharing that. We have just a couple of 2 questions. We have time for 2 questions, yes. Is there a microphone floating around?
Hi, my name's Jeremy. I'm in a joint MD and master's program at UCSF and UC Berkeley. And about 2 years ago, we had the devastating fires in Northern California. and we were doing a little bit of work in Santa Rosa, which is just an hour north of San Francisco. And one of the things we were discussing is that beyond mental health linkage to climate and environmental change, just discussing mental health in general in a lot of cultures and community is taboo. And so I was wondering, in your community resilience interventions, pre-disasters or long-term climate effects like drought and post-disasters, how do you approach the fact that in a lot of cultures and communities, even discussing mental health is a challenge and a taboo subject for a lot of people?
So I'll take a quick answer to that. That's something I have to do all the time. The simple answer is we almost never use psychiatric labels as a way to have conversations about mental health. We use positive wellness ideas. We use social determinants. For example, in a community in India where if I'm dealing with a drought, what I'll be really talking about is the impact the drought has on the person's well-being, how it's affecting their minds, and then entering the conversations of mental health in that particular route, rather than starting by saying, do you have depression? Are you suicidal?
I'd strongly second that. We never talk about mental health, and certainly not about mental disorders. We talk about social circumstances, dealing with tough times, coping with disasters, rebuilding after disasters, anything but mental health. And sure enough, mental health is brought up soon enough, but we never start that conversation.
One more question.
Hi there. My name is Margot Parks. I'm originally from New Zealand, from Ngāi Tahu territory, but I live in northern British Columbia. I really want to thank the organisers for having this panel. The mental health aspects of these planetary health and eco-health conversations are so important. My question is building off the earlier session with a strong focus on urban health. The work that I do tends to be in rural, remote, Indigenous communities, which we do understand is not the majority of the people on the planet anymore. But as we know, we can't just focus on the majority of the people on the planet. And we do need to understand this complex rural, remote, urban dynamic, not least because those same urban systems are dependent on the landscapes in rural, remote, and the vast other areas. So I just wonder, could you speak to some of the nuance of mental health and well-being as you understand it, as we juggle between the denser populated areas and the much less dense rural remote landscapes where a lot of the social and environmental change is taking place? Thank you.
Great to meet someone from across the ditch. Hi. That's an incredibly important area, and I think picking up on something that Vikram was talking about earlier and has done so much work on, we can't forget those in the greatest need, even if they're minority groups, and those living in remote areas and Indigenous communities are among those with the greatest needs, particularly in the context of climate change. We found in our empirical work time and time again that those living closest to the land are those who are the canaries in the cage for what climate change is going to do to all of us. And farmers and Indigenous people particularly so, because they live so closely to the land and off the land and as part of the land often. And often what we found is very deep insights from these groups into what climate change may do to our mental health and well-being, and also the kinds of things that we can do to resist the pernicious impact and build on the opportunities. And one of the really lovely things that's come out of conversations I've had with Indigenous Australians is that climate change offers an opportunity for all of us to reconnect with the land and with the natural environment, and to find some things that we may have lost. And I think that's a really lovely place for supporting mental health to go. When it comes to urban settings, I think the session that we heard earlier, particularly David's comments around slums and the fact that sometimes we've focused on rural areas as the areas most needing health support and support in infrastructure and other ways. And in fact, we probably haven't focused on urban slums enough, and I think he's right on the money with that. We haven't. And Vikram will talk a little bit more about this, but as he was saying earlier, people move from rural areas into cities in search of better opportunities and work and employment and to solve all sorts of problems in their lives, not understanding what that means and how their lives will change and the kinds of new problems that they'll have to solve. And climate change will be one of the things that drives people into cities because they can't live on and off the land in the ways that that they once used to or need to. So I think this is a very important point that you've raised.
As an Indigenous youth of this territory, I want to voice that when we talk about these reactions, when we talk about some of these occurrences, when we say how are people impacted, especially those of marginalized or socioeconomically disparaged communities, when we think about environmental change, let's think about the Indigenous peoples whose environment changed thanks to settler colonialism. This is a behavior that has been adapted. This is a behavior that has been divorced from accountability, humility, and just reciprocity to the environment. So when we recognize that settler colonialism, this catastrophic occurrence of colonization that is impacting the world for our modern conveniences, we need to recognize that Indigenous peoples all around the world have been sustaining their own communities and with their own technologies, their own sciences, and their own wisdoms, of which we can yield a lot of strategies towards a sustainable future. And so I highly recommend that just because business as usual, capitalism, consumerism, materialistic nation, convenient society is something that we've grown used to, we should think about what it means to honor the past to shape the future.
Hear, hear.